Hey friends, so sorry to see you here, but hopefully I've got information you're hunting for. We are still talking sewing machine troubleshooting, tension specifically, and today is all about threads. So I've got some more great information for you. I'm glad you're here. Hopefully this will solve some of those problems. Let's get started. And welcome back to Sew Well, everybody. I am your host, Rob Appel. I'm super excited to have you right here at the Stitch in Heaven Network. If you have not already subscribed, just take a moment and do so right now. Hit that little bell to be notified whenever we're doing a new video or going live, maybe doing a giveaway, having some sort of fun like that. I don't want you to miss anything. And I'm super excited you're here. I hope you're not really having problems with your sewing machine tension, but you just love a good old sewing tutorial, and that's why you're here today. But if you're like so many of us and your tension system causes stress in your life, well, welcome to the club, everybody. It is sewing, and so much of what we have to do is all about the tension on our thread, the way that it makes the projects look when it's finished, the way that we have choices over the way we can free motion quilt sometimes, the way our embroidery systems work, and there are so many things that are related to tension on and off of the sewing machine. So I did a whole other video about the basics of tension and how they work, the systems on your machine, talking about your presser foot lifter and the tension discs, talking about setting your bobbin tension, some of those kinds of things. So today I really just want to focus on thread, getting our thread balanced out, give you some tips and techniques that might help you understand thread better, and that will help you understand the final half of the tension troubleshooting. So first of all, watch that other video. Make sure you understand how your machine is designed to work so that you're not trying to troubleshoot something that is already broken on your machine. Make sense? Okay, so check that out. Now, today we're going to talk about tension, using our threads to control and or balance. And some of the things I'm going to talk about, and like especially in the last video, I was talking about no tension. Well, no tension looks like this, folks. This is the red thread is from the needle, from the top. We're looking at the bottom of the project, and I took the thread out of the tension discs to cause a bunch of these big loops. So that is no tension. That means the machine is generally not functioning properly, or you just didn't thread the machine proper with the thread inside of your tension discs. Your foot was probably down when you were threading the machine. There, you've already got the info. What I want to focus on more today is tension issues that might look like this. So maybe you can see within our sample that you can see the red thread, which was from the top. That's the needle thread. The white thread is our bobbin thread. And that's the first trick I want to offer today. When you're starting to troubleshoot to see which portion of your machine is maybe a little too tight or a little too loose, I would like you to use the same weight threads you're going to use in your final sample, your final project. But if you can use different colors while you're testing, it'll make it so much easier for you to determine, is the problem really on the top or is the problem really in the bobbin? So a lot of times, and like you see on my samples, I'm using two different color threads simply to dial in that balance where my tension splits perfectly in my fabric. Let's talk a little bit about expectations. Sew Well is about sewing and wellness. And one of the things that goes wrong in my life so often is I set too big of expectations for myself for the day or whatever I have ahead, and I don't get everything done and I start to get a little stressed out. A whole different kind of stress than thread tension, right? Well, if you have a single layer of fabric and you have heavy thread, you can't expect those two threads to break in a single layer of fabric. But what I've got going on here is two layers of fabric and a nice poly cotton batting. So I've got a little bit of fluff. I've got somewhere for the thread to hide. So I really do want my tension. I want my threads to lock in the batting, and I'd really like to see just a touch of white on the top in my red thread and just a touch of red on the back in my white thread. So right now I'm seeing a little bit too much tension on the bottom of my project. And when it comes to setting our thread tension, my rules are we start with the bobbin, because for the most part your bobbin tension isn't going to change very much. And as a matter of fact, If you do not know how to adjust your bobbin tension, do not. Because once you start to adjust your bobbin tension, it can be very challenging for you to get it back to the right tension settings, especially if you have one of these drop-in bobbins. So if you open a little door and you drop your bobbin in from the top of the machine, you're probably going to have a very difficult time changing the actual tension spring on that bobbin case. It's a little spring. As a matter of fact, I've showed you in the last video. I'm not even going to show you in this video. I don't want you trying to adjust the tension on a drop-in bobbin machine. You can buy an additional tension system for a drop-in bobbin machine, but that's for really heavy threads with really low numbers like 8 or 12, for example. Right now, I'm using my standard quilting weight thread, which is a 40 weight thread. And if you're not aware, that's partially something we need to get you to understand quickly, is the numbering system with threads. So the higher the number on thread, the finer it is actually. So one of my rules, hopefully you'll all remember this, but when it comes to sewing machine numbering, if it is bolted to the machine, if it is connected to the machine physically, including your needle, the bigger the number, the bigger the effect. So if I take my tension disc and I go from 4 where it belongs up to 6, I'm getting more tension on my upper thread. If I take my stitch and I go from 2 to 4, it's making it longer, right? So everything that is bolted to the machine, the bigger the number, the bigger the effect. But your thread is not bolted to the machine. Your thread simply runs through the machine to get to the final project. It's not connected to your machine in any way, shape, or form. It's just sliding on through. Therefore, it must be different. And the bigger the number, the finer the thread, right? So in my bobbin case, number 1, if I put my bobbin thread in and it feels too loose, and I've confirmed that I've pulled it all the way through my spring, made everything fit just right. Let me show you that. So I've taken my thread, I've got my finger on top of my bobbin, and I pull it all the way over. And this isn't a drop-in bobbin only. This trick works great. I bring it around, and if I don't feel any tension right now, I'm simply going to use the same color thread, but in a much heavier weight thread. So for example, a lot of bobbin threads are going to be a 60 weight or an 80 weight, which is a very fine thread. You can get more on the bobbin. You don't have to stop as often. It's a great feature. However, if you can't adjust, and I don't want you to adjust your drop-in bobbin case, you might want to use a size 30 or 40 thread, which is going to be a much heavier thread, which is going to in fact have more tension in that same bobbin case without making any adjustments. I'm hoping that makes sense, because the very first step to balancing our thread tension on our machines is getting the bobbin case dialed in. Now maybe you have a bobbin case that looks like an old standard bobbin case, like one of these ones that I have. Now this particular bobbin case does not have a check spring in it. So when I pull on this bobbin or I dangle it, I can feel it dropping about an inch, but it is not running away. It's nice and taut, and that is how I want my bobbin thread set in a standard bobbin case. Some bobbin cases actually have a check spring inside, like the one from this straight stitch only machine. This is a high-speed machine used for quilting. A lot of times it's going to have an additional spring that's inside of the bobbin case, and that's going to keep the bobbin from spinning too much when you stop, when you're free motion quilting, something like that. But because of this, that spring only goes into effect once the bobbin is in the machine. So therefore, I'm going to put my thread in just like I'm supposed to, let it zig and zag back around that spring. And this is the kind of spring I could adjust. I could put a screwdriver in the bigger of the two screws, the one that's closer to the opening on my bobbin case, and I could tighten and loosen that, right? But on this particular bobbin case with a check spring in it, I want to be able to lift it vertically off my table, but as I pull this, it's just going to sit right on the table. It's not going anywhere. I can't lift it into the air. There's not enough tension on the thread until I go ahead and put it into the sewing machine. Once it's in the sewing machine, there's considerably more tension because the bobbin case has now locked the bobbin against that little disc in there, and everything's going to stay nice and tight, and that's going to cause that additional tension we need there in that bobbin case thread. So again, rule number 1 is make sure your bobbin tension is set appropriately. a medium balance on your bobbin case itself before you put it into the machine. Then go ahead and thread your machine as you always would. Number one thing, we've talked about this over and over again. Make sure that your presser foot lifter is in the up position. Your foot is all the way up. This presser foot lifter opens the discs on your tension assembly on the upper side. That way, as you thread the machine, the thread is going all the way into the tension discs. And as you lower your tension discs, make sure that you can grab hold of your thread, and as you pull on it, you really want to feel a considerable change immediately. Even see that needle wiggle. Yell fish on if it helps you remember. But when that foot is down, I want to have considerable tension on my upper thread. Of course, from that point, we can just run a straight stitch. We can run a sewing sample like I've done here through the machine. And I'm looking on both sides to make sure that I have a nice balanced amount of tension. As I pointed out earlier, this is tension what happens when I have no tension at all. So that's not what we're looking for. So as we're sewing through now, it's a tug of war. You want to make sure that as you turn your dial, increasing the number, that you'll start to see the bottom thread rise to the top of your project. Because the number one adjustments we're doing is on the top of the machine. Remember, your tension disc is usually set from a 0 to a 9, and your regular tension setting is 4 or 4.5, right in the middle of that disc. So when you put in a nice fine thread, you should be able to tighten this up clockwise, increasing the number, or coming over to your dial or your computer screen and increasing the number, higher the tension setting is going to be. And when you put more squeeze on your upper thread, that should therefore start to bring that bobbin thread into the batting or into the top of the project. Same thing is if you're finding that you already have too much of your bobbin thread showing on the top of your project. First of all, make sure your bobbin is really under tension. Make sure the thread from the bobbin is running properly through the tension. If not, go back and repeat the steps we just looked at, making sure that the bobbin is in the bobbin case properly, that it zigs and zags through the tension system there, or your drop-in bobbin is seated correctly. Remember, bobbin tension first. Once that's secured though, if it's pulling up, you can loosen your upper tension and looking at your dial. Again, if it's set way up in the 6, the 7, the 8, you should expect to be pulling that bobbin thread up to the top of your project. Remember, you want your tension normally set about a 4. And that actually really goes for free motion quilting as well. Sometimes you may want to drop it just a little bit, but I often don't drop much. What I find is the big problem with tension with free motion quilting is we put some sort of a hopping style presser foot on, but we don't see that we need to lower the presser foot. So we actually leave the lifter lever up because the foot is going up and down with the needle. So we don't see that we've actually left those tension discs open. So if you're doing free motion and you're getting loops on the backside, check to make sure your foot is all the way down. That's the number one problem with tension when we are getting started for free motion. I might lower my tension from a 4, 4.5 down to a 3, but not much lower. You really shouldn't need to unless you have a very, very thick batting or you're making very large stitches with your free motion. But that brings me to another point, and we are going to talk about thread management here in a second. But another point that really happens when it comes into your thread tension balance, especially talking about free motion. Are your stitches too small? Are your stitches too big? So if you're getting some eyelashing or some laddering on the backside, a lot of times your tension is too loose and your stitches are too big. In this situation where I'm showing you these little red dots, that's where I was taking way too many stitches in the same location. Probably 7, 8, 9 stitches at one stitch point. So the thread starts to build up. You just start to see the thread build up from the back on this particular one. So if I were seeing those same bumps here and again, not at the tips, I would be concerned. But because I'm seeing them at the tips of where I was creating the holly design, I know that's just me needing to improve my motion of free motion a little bit. And that's part of understanding balance of your thread tension is, was it the machine or was it you? Most of the time, our thread tension is set properly when our feed dogs are up and everything is sewing along proper because the machine is moving the fabric at the pace that the thread wants to come out. It's when we get into free motion that things start to really go haywire because we're moving everything and we're going big and we're going small with our stitches, and the thread can go all over the place as well. So that's probably a video for a whole nother day, just troubleshooting tension and threads for free motion. But there's something I want to talk about that could be related to free motion or just general sewing, and that's these bigger spools or these bigger cones. We'll call them king spools. A lot of sewing machines nowadays will have the benefit of setting a thread up on the top like this, or on this machine it actually lays inside. Well, when this thread lays inside of this machine, it actually doesn't have a ton of room to get up and over the spools. That can actually cause a lot of problems right there, and an irregular amount of problems as your thread goes up and down this spool itself. If that cap is much larger than the spool, at a certain point it's trying to climb vertically straight up and over the cap that's holding the spool in place. And that can start to cause a lot of erratic thread issues. Maybe it'll start to be too tight on the top, so it'll pull your bobbin thread up to the top of the project for 4, 5, 6 stitches. May even break the thread, but if it releases, then you'll notice that that stops and goes away, and it can be a real problem. So getting the thread inside of the machine properly, and this, as much as I love my Aurifil thread and this Juki machine, it doesn't work great in here. So you may want to run some sort of a vertical spool stand, or if you have a machine like this, you're going to always run the vertical spool stand, no matter if your thread is a cross wound thread or a straight wound thread. There's a whole debate of how the thread should be lying, but in my best opinion, I have another rule for that, and that is the thread should never rotate in my presence. So I actually never use my spool vertically without some sort of a thread stand over it, because with this, as I pull on my thread, let's put that foot up so the tension's wide open. As I pull on the thread, there is no additional friction added because the thread is just coming off the top of the spool ever so nicely right now. Now imagine you're using these size spools of thread and you don't have something like this to help the thread come off of the spool nicely. Well, this thread right now weighs considerably more than this thread spool does because there's so much more thread on this spool. So if this thread had to just sit here and spin because there wasn't a thread stand like this, if it was coming straight to my tension, that adds an enormous amount of friction or weight to the thread. Therefore, if you were balancing your tension to begin with something like this, you would set your tension on top very, very low. You wouldn't need much of a squeeze in your discs because all that squeeze is literally coming from the weight of the spool. But as you quilt and you quilt and you quilt, remember the thread is not connected to the machine. It is only lying on the machine, sliding through the machine to be part of the finished project. When it gets down to a much lighter weight spool, well, when you turn that project over, you're going to start to see loops on the back because now there's not enough tension because we had this set too loose to compensate for the weight originally. Now that that weight has gone down because we put the thread in the quilt, we needed to adjust our tension. So that's why I go back to the number one rule when it comes to a thread spool. It never rotates in my presence. The thread always freely comes off over the top or off of the front end if it's sitting horizontally in my machine. Nothing is keeping it caught, nothing is snagging on it, and I always run quite a distance of thread after threading my machine to make sure that my thread isn't caught on the spool cap or isn't getting caught somewhere along the thread stand as it goes. You can actually purchase additional thread stands. I've even seen folks make them out of coffee cups and a coat hanger duct taped over the back of the machine, whatever they need to do. But if you like using these bigger spools of thread, definitely make sure you have some sort of thread stand that allows the thread to come straight off the top of the spool and then travel into your standard tensioning devices. That way you can make sure there's proper tension on all of your threads as you're sewing. Remember, balancing that thread should just be a few turns of your dial on your upper tension, but that is going to come easy to you if you have the thread in the bobbin case correctly, and if you have the proper weight of thread in your bobbin case if it's a drop-in bobbin. Remember that 50 weight thread is going to be finer than your 30 weight thread, and we can use 30, 40, 50 weight when quilting, no problem. I will even sometimes not use the same weight in the bobbin as I do in the top to make my tension come together. And another little trick, whenever I'm doing embroidery, especially of letters that are going to be really tight, I always use the exact same thread in the bobbin as I do in the top of the machine. That way, if there is any tension discrepancies, I'm not going to see them, because it's going to be so minute. And that's the thing I'd like to leave you with now. Once you get your tension dialed in and you know it's working properly in the machine because you watched the first video, and now you know you've got your threads balanced because you watched this video and understood some of those little things it took to get the tensions balanced just right. Now put in the colors threads you want, let them match. You may even want to change your bobbin with each of your top, especially in free motion quilting, because there are going to be times where things just don't go perfectly. And by having those threads matching, you're going to hide any irregularities in your tension, and that way you can just keep on sewing and enjoying the entire process. So I hope this video really helped you out. Again, we would love to have you subscribe to the entire Stitch in Heaven YouTube network. We've got a bunch of great content creators here. This show is called Sew Well, and I will see you next time with something sewing or wellness or both related. Thanks again, folks. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. It really helps support our channel. If you haven't subscribed, do so now. Hit the little button to be notified every time we go live or do a new video for all of you. And here's one from the past I think you'll really enjoy.